Hi, and welcome to episode 2 of Liquid Gold, the new vlog about the wonderful world of whisky. My name's Callum McFadgen. Today we are going Viking as we continue our journey through the whisky making regions of Scotland. And today we're going to be going up through the Highlands to the far north and even beyond the Highlands across the Pentland Firth to the ancient Orkney Islands. Now, just above the Orcadian capital town of Kirkwall lies the Highland Park Distillery. Highland Park is one of two distilleries on the Orkney Islands, the other being Scapa. But Highland Park is the most northern distillery in Scotland by about half a mile. In geopolitical terms, the Orkney Islands are not part of the Highlands region, but with the Shetland Islands, they make up a region of their own right in Scotland. But in the whisky industry, all the islands in Scotland are classed as part of the Highland region, with the exception of Islay. So the name of the Highland Park Distillery doesn't come from being in the Highlands. It comes from the name of the land on which it sits, which was known as the High Park of Rosebank. So before I really start on with the story of Highland Park, if you remember in the last episode, we talked about a very young whisky when it comes straight out of the stills and it's still a spirit and we can't really call it whisky. We had this really light, clear liquid. So this here is a bottle of new make spirit from Highland Park. It's been watered down to about 50%. Now, I've not tried this yet, so I'm going to give it a go. This is going to be really interesting and I'll tell you what it's like. So here we go. So immediately on the nose, we get this malty breadiness, and I find that you get that from almost all whisky new makes, and you expect that for a malt whisky. But this one also has a slight smokiness to it, slightly floral hint. Now, the Orkney Islands are covered in heather, and they use peat for malting the barley. But unlike on Islay, where you have this very rich, heavy, smoky, earthy, peaty whisky, the peat on Orkney is heather based, so you have a much lighter floral nose to it. Now, even though it's been watered down, it's 50%, but it still packs a bit of a punch and leaves a little tingle on the tongue. But that malty breadiness really, really comes through. But it also has a slight hint of grassiness to it. But for something that's a really young spirit straight out of the still, it's actually quite pleasant. And I really do like it. But this heathery floralness and the malty breadiness really comes through. And that is the basis of all the Highland Park distillery whiskies. Now, if you ever get a chance to try new make, it's a great way to really get the distillery character before the spirit is put into the casks to mature and it draws out the influence of the bourbon flavour or the sherry flavour. But that's a really nice little dram in its own right. So the distillery of Highland Park was opened by a guy called Magnus Jonsson, who was better known locally as Mansi. And he was named after St. Magnus, the patron saint of the Orkney Islands. Now, the distillery was opened in 1798, which meant that the whisky and the spirit produced then was technically illegal. Illicit whisky, just like most whisky, was before the 1823 Excise Act. And at the time, the distillery was known as Rosebank, as I said earlier, named after the High Park of Rosebank. But that's not to be confused with the long-lost Lowland distillery of the same name. So the distillery later changed its name, and it was known as the Kirkwall Distillery for a while, but the whisky was generally known as Highland Park. And eventually, the distillery name changed to what we know today. And as with most distilleries, the ownership has changed through the years. From Mansi Ewanson, it later was owned by John Robertson, who was an ex-Heisman, and he had actually chased Mansi, the illegal whisky distiller, before he became a whisky maker himself. And later on, the distillery passed to a minister, the Reverend James Borwick, and he sold the distillery for £450 because he felt that distilling alcohol didn't really tie in with his religious beliefs. And eventually, James Grant took over the distillery. So Grant increased the capacity of Highland Park, but the distillery was affected by the Patterson crash of 1898. There was a huge boom and bust in the whisky industry in the late 19th century, and when it collapsed, it was disastrous for many, many distilleries. But Highland Park survived right through the crash and even continued producing whisky right through World War I. Now, to come forward to today, Highland Park is one of the most popular whiskies in the world, and over the last 10 years or so, they've gone through a big branding change, which is to reflect the Viking heritage of the Orkney Islands. Now, as I said, the islands are ancient, and some of you may know the ancient settlement of Skara Brae, which dates back to the Neolithic period over 3,000 years ago. And the Vikings are historically much more recent than that, coming to Scotland in the late 10th century and 11th century. And there are well over 20 different expressions of Highland Park, and a lot are named after mythological figures from Viking folklore or people from Orcadian history. But you can still get the standard drams, which is great because it's a really great introductory dram for most people, bring them into whisky. This is the Highland Park 12. This is one of the old styles of the Highland Park bottle. And more recently, the bottles have been updated. And instead of having the cliche stereotype of Vikings with helmets and horns coming out, they chose to decorate the bottles using ancient wood carvings found in a church in Norway. So you can buy this Highland Park 12-year-old for around about £40. And there are various age statements right through to the 40-year-old, which sells for a pretty impressive £2,400. So, on the nose of the Highland Park 12, you get this very sweet nose comes through. Now, Highland Park predominantly uses sherry casks for maturing the whisky, about 80% of the casks they use, and that costs the distillery around about £20 million a year just to get the casks for maturing their whisky. Now, it's moderately peated, around about 20 parts per million, but as I said, it's a much lighter floral heathery type peat rather than the earthy peat of Islay. So, slightly smoky, slightly heathery, really sweet, and you get this really nice sweet honey flavour really comes through. And you really get that coming through on the palate as well. Slight fruitiness and a slight brininess as well. Just a little hint of salt, salad, and maybe something like red berries, possibly a slight hint of cherry or even dried oranges. So that's the Highland Park 12-year-old, and it's a great dram to introduce people to whisky drinking on. Now, the next dram is from the Viking range. This is Einar, and it's available only in duty-free or travel shops. So airports or on international ferries, you'll be able to find this Einar. And unlike the standard Highland Park range, this is predominantly matured in bourbon casks. So it's a much lighter spirit. Now, just top this up a little bit here. And if you can see, compare the colour of the two. This one here is slightly darker than that one there. It doesn't really show up on the screen, but the Einar is slightly lighter in colour. And that comes from being in the bourbon cask as opposed to that rich red sherry cask. And that also affects the flavour. This is a much sweeter, lighter whisky, more honey rather than the sweetness of the grape. So you don't get as much the smokiness. It's much lighter actually in the Einar, but the flavour coming from a slightly sulphury, sweet fruit flavour in the Highland Park 12, you tend to get a little bit more of a vanilla and a slightly more citrusy flavour, but not a bitter citrus flavour like a lemon, but more a sweetness of a tangerine or nectarine or something like that. So I'm going to finish up, but I'm very quickly going to show you two other Highland Park bottlings here. And these come from independent bottlers. This one from the McGivens Provenance range, and it was specially bottled for the Edinburgh University's Water of Life Society in 2010. Now, the society had Darren Leach from the Whisky Shop in Edinburgh come out with various samples of whisky for us to try as a group, and we selected the one that the people liked the most. And this year we happened to pick this 12-year-old Highland Park. It was a much lighter whisky than the standard 12-year-old, probably closer to the Einar. But that's a great whisky and a little bit of Wall's history there. One very last whisky I'm going to show you, and this is something really special. This was bottled for Runrig, one of my favourite Scottish rock bands. And it was bottled to celebrate the year of homecoming in 2009 in a concert that Runrig held at Scone. Now, this is a 22-year-old Highland Park, and when they produce special bottlings like this, I tend to buy two. One to drink and try, and one to keep. So this is my keeping one. Now, this one was really quite a light whiskey, but it still had some of that sweetness from the sherry came through, but the floral smokiness from it was absolutely amazing. It was really, really nice. So that was bottled by Duncan Taylor, which is an independent bottlers up in Speyside. So that's a little bit about Highland Park. I hope you, if you see it out there, go out, try it. And if you've never tried whisky before, Highland Park is a great whisky to start with. Hope you enjoy it, and I'll see you next time on the vlog. Until then, Sanjiva.